Welcome to the highlight of the LinkedIn clone. In this video we'll be implementing all of the logic for our messaging system. So as you can see, on the left hand side we're logged in as user 1, John 1, and on the right hand side we're logged in as user 2. And if I go ahead and I just send a message from user 1 to user 2, we can see that it appears and you get the correct image and the correct date and message, of course. And if I were to write back, you'll see that John 2 has written back to John 1. And also there's no weird behavior, such as if you're in the conversation with John 3 and then John 2 sends a message to John 3. We can see that the room is self-contained. And of course, if I leave this area and I come back to the messaging, it retrieves all of the messaging. So it's important that you've watched some of the previous videos. This can be a little bit tricky. There's a lot of logic to implement here, and you really need to be comfortable with RxJS and also the previous videos where we've set up the WebSockets. So you haven't seen that already, go back and watch those. And let's just go ahead and get started. So the first thing we'll see is that the UI doesn't look too bad, but we're unable to click on different rooms. And right now our messaging's just set up so that there's no difference between the rooms, and also the data isn't persisted. So we're going to go ahead and add those in. But before I do that, I want to be able to select a room, and we're going to have this little green rectangle here. So what I'll do is I'll just open up the VS Code, and I've done a npm run start dev for the Nest server and also Ionic serve. But let's just start in the LinkedIn in the front end project, and let's navigate to the chat component. So let's just open up the HTML, the CSS, and also the TypeScript. So around when we're rendering each of the friends, we want to add a click event here, and we're saying let friend of friends, and let's also add a let I equals the index so we can get the index. And what that will allow us to do is we can say open conversation, and we can pass in the friend that's being rendered and also the index here. So let's just go ahead and create this open conversation function, and we'll just open that up here. So we have this open conversation here, and we need to just declare some variables here. So we've got friends. Let's also have a friend, which will just be the singular, and we'll have that unassigned. And let's also have the observable version of the friend. We'll make this a behavior subject of the type user, and we can say new behavior subject of the type user, and initially they'll just be an empty object. But we also want to have, and we'll come back to that, we'll need to set that up later on. But let's just go ahead and just add all of these here. So then we can do that. And then also what we'll have is we'll have the selected conversation index, which is just a number, and we'll set that equal to 0. So with that, we can go return to our function that we just created, the open conversation function. And we know from the template that's going to take the friend and also the index. So let's just go ahead and specify those parameters. We'll have a friend of the type user and an index of the type number. Now this won't be returning anything, so we'll just say returns void. But what we'll have is we'll have this selected conversation index, which is initially 0, will be set to the index that we're passing in. And we can also say for later on, the particular friend that we've selected is equal to friend, and also the observable version of that. And of course you could probably refactor this, but as you'll see later on, this version comes in handy as well. So since we've got a behavior subject, we can just actively call the next friend based on what we're passing into it. And then go ahead and save that. But what we're more interested in just for now is selecting the conversation index such that we can have some sort of ng class on our element here. So let's just see how we can do that. We can think that, okay, so we've got this class friend, which we've defined before. And I actually might put the ng4 and the click event first. So we can have the class here, and then we can also have an ng class, and we can set this equal to alright, so we can create a class and we'll call it selected conversation, and we'll need to put single quotes around this. And what we'll do is, based on the selected conversation index that we've set, if this is equal to the particular index, then we'll apply that class. So let's just go to our SCSS component here, and if we go to the select connection, which is this main left section here, nested within there, what we can do just at the end here, but still contained within the friend section, we can have that selected connection. Actually, what was it? Selected conversation. And in that case, what we can do is we can just have a border left of 4 pixels, solid, green. So let's just go ahead and save that, see where we're at. So right now, nothing's being applied here. So let's just see why not. And I believe this should just be tabbed down one. So let's just do an alt down. And let's see if this works. So right now you can see the green arrow's been applied, or the green rectangle. And if we click on the next one, we can see that's moving. But we are seeing a bit of a jerk. The rest of the image is moving, so we'll just need to offset that. And how we can do that is quite simple actually. Where we've got the friend here, we can have a border left of 4 pixels solid transparent. So we'll save that. And now when we click and change the user we can see that there's no jerking there. Okay, so that's the initial styling. We can close the SCSS file, we won't need that again. Now, the next thing we want to do is we just want to Control C, and we want to use the NestCLI to generate a service. So let's just go ahead and do that. And in the chat folder, and actually we do want to do that, but what we firstly want to do is we want to use the Ionic CLI. So Ionic G to generate a service in the front end. Now, right now we've got this core, and which has error handling. We can also go ahead and put inside here our new socket service, because in its current state, if we look at the app module, the API, the front end version, right now we're configuring the socket here for root config, but what would be better and what we'll need for our application is we will actually want to set this up in a service. So that means when we enter the chat module, which is nested within the home module, when that service is instantiated, then we'll be able to get our socket behavior, and you'll see later on why that's needed. So for that, rather than doing it this standard way, because we have a little bit more complexity, we'll need to do it in a it's not a unique way, it's still a standard way as well. It's just doing it when it's not configured at the app module level. So we'll just go ahead and get a service here, and we'll call it the chat socket service. So inside core here, we can just go ahead and call it chat socket. Let's get that. Now we don't need the spec file, so let's just go ahead and delete that. And let's open up our service. And we can already start to copy a few things here. We can get this config. This won't be needed here. We'll just put it up here for now. And we can go ahead and we can remove the socket IO for root here. We no longer need that. And that means we can go ahead and get rid of these imports, but I'm just going to go ahead and cut them because we can just use them here. The socket IO config and the socket IO module. Although I don't think we'll need the module because we're doing it in a slightly different approach. But what we will need instead of that is the socket. So we got this service here, and it's the chat socket service, and we need to go ahead and we need to extend the socket class here, and this is configured, like this is already set up through NGX. This is just looking through the documentation, and this is just an alternative approach to the module configuration. It's the service approach without the modularity. So we can go ahead and get that. Now we will see that this is erroring here, and that's because we're extending socket, and that means we just need to have a call to the base class, so, or the subclass. So we can go ahead and just call super based on our configuration here. So we can actually just close the app module at this stage because it's not defined there anymore. but we can actually, what we'll need to do is recall in our chat gateway, and I'll open that up. So far what we've been working with is very primitive. We do have this cause here with origin localhost 8100 for our Ionic application. We need to do this in addition to our regular HTTP REST API. So right now what's happening is we're communicating from the client, and we're trying to make a WebSocket connection to the server such that we can have that socket communication between the server and client, i.e. when you send a message you want to push from the server to the connected client through a subscription using RxJS on the front end. So you do need to specify the back end. So right now we're pointing towards the URL localhost 3000, so that's okay. But we've got a little bit more complexity in our application where we actually want to have some JWT guarding on the these socket endpoints. So we need to set that up properly. So within these options here, we can actually have another object called transport options, and there's something in there called polling. And what polling allows us to do is allows us to apply some extra headers. So extra headers. And what we want here is the authorization header. And how we're going to do this is basically we need the JSON Web Token, and we know that's in local storage, so we can just go ahead and just call local storage, get item, and it's called capacitor storage. That's the prefix because we set and get it with the capacitor method. But I'm doing it with the, the more general way, the local storage, just because of the extra complexity in getting that in this nested object in a service that's been extended of socket. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that, and that's all we really need. So we just need to verify that the JSON Web Token that we have in local storage is present, and also so when we make the request to the server and make the WebSocket connection, it can verify that, and it can just make the request from there. It's the WebSocket communication is just building up on HTTP, so everything that we've done previously with HTTP and JSON Web Token, it's just a constant communication stream using that fundamental protocol. So that's all we really need here in the chat socket service. So what we can do, since we've removed it from the chat gateway, we've removed it from the app module, we're going to need to reference it in our chat component here. So let's just go ahead and get that in there. So one thing to note is right now we've been using ng on init and ng on destroy. We actually want to use the Ionic lifecycle methods because these will only occur once, basically when application's created and you navigate there, and when it's destroyed, but we could be navigating back and forth between the chat page and other pages, or we could log off into a different user and all sorts of things. So what I actually want to do is I just want to get rid of this implements on init and on destroy, and I can just go ahead and use the Ionic approach. So IonView did enter, ion view did leave, and we can also, since they're now being called, we can now we can use this approach here where we have this user image path subscription, which is of the type subscription, and I might move the subscriptions down a little bit in their own section here because we'll have a few of them. And that means when we set our subscription here, we can go ahead and we can unsubscribe to that. So I'll just have a look if there's any others, so I can get rid of this refactor unsubscribe message here. So yeah, right here we can say this dot and we'll call it this dot conversation subscription, and when we set it equal to this will still run. It's just in this case we're able to unsubscribe from it with our Ionic lifecycle methods. So let's just go ahead and copy this down so we can see we have this conversation subscription. It gets the new messages. Actually, let's name it this message subscription, but we'll also have one for the conversation subscription as well. So this message subscription, and we'll set this one equal to this dot conversation subscription. Actually, we don't have the conversation just yet. I'm going to call this the friend subscription. Sorry, just getting ahead of myself here. This is actually the friend subscription. Friend subscription. And we'll add some more things in soon. So let's just get this message subscription and also the friend subscription. And we're going to change all this anyway. So let's just come here and do an unsubscribe. Shift Alt down it, so then we can just change this to the friend subscription. And now we shouldn't be getting any memory leaks. And of course, you can refactor the application in other areas to have this style if you wish. But we will be focusing on the core features of the WebSocket Socket IO communication to the server. So let's just go ahead and run the Ionic serve just to make sure that the new WebSocket is working, and also that these things are working here. So we could just have a console log here. We'll get rid of this, but just to see in the console is working here. So I have a console did leave, did enter, and I may as well have one in the chat socket service as well, just to make sure that it's being called here. Chat socket. Alright, so we've got this here. I can close this one here and press F12. We can see that we don't have any of those messages appearing. Let's see, we're getting some sort of error here. Uncaught null error, no provider. Okay, so let's fix this. So I must have forgot to put this in here when I was refactoring the other stuff, but the chat socket service, we can go ahead and we can just grab that, and we'll import this here, and we'll save that. Actually, we don't want it here, sorry. We want it in the chat service rather than having it here. So I'm just going to get rid of these and also these lifecycle methods here. And then I'm just going to go to the services here. We see we've got this chat service here, and we're actually already injecting it here. So we've got the private socket, but rather than coming from socket now we're going to be using the chat socket service. So I'm just going to continue to call this socket, but so we'll need to import this here. So then these things should still work here. So let's see if that now works. So we'll refresh our Ionic application here. Just taking a moment to load here. If I navigate to the messaging tab, we see we've got socket did enter and did leave. So that's how we're going to handle our subscriptions. So that was just to demonstrate. Now I can just go ahead and remove the logs, get rid of that, I can close it up, and here in the chat component we can get rid of the console logs. Okay, so what we've done so far is we started by working on the front end to select a particular conversation, and we've sort of refactored things in preparation for our JSON Web Token secured WebSocket routes that we're going to be calling. So now we actually need to implement all of the tables and set those up. So they're all sort of integrated together. So we're going to have a conversation table in Postgres. So you can imagine that each conversation contains two people. So we're going to need to do a many-to-many sort of relation for this sort of thing, because there's also going to be many messages in each of these conversations, and there's also going to be active users. So the way we want to do this is, well, when we first come here, it should load the first person, and that means we should load all of the existing messages if there are any, and we need to display them with the date and with the correct picture and the message and all that. And then we also need to make it so that, because right now we're able to send that, but it's in both the rooms, so we need to isolate the rooms, and there's a bit of logic that needs to be implemented for that to be achieved. So not only do we have the conversation, but we also have the active conversation. So all these conversations will be created based on the friends list here, but the active conversations, they'll only be created when you clicked on one. So that means we'll have to be able to leave a conversation and get the ID of the conversation, and then also having the right users in the conversation and the active conversation, and making the messages relate to those. So you can see that it's quite integrated. There's going to be lots of relations here, and we need to build those tables up so we're able to store data and retrieve data from those different entities. So let's go ahead and start to do that. So we'll go into our API, and I'm just going to kill this because we're going to generate a few things here. So let's just open our API folder up. Let's just collapse everything and then open our source folder up. Now we're going to be working within the chat section here. So we're going to have a new folder for our models, and we're also going to have a another folder for our servers. So let's just create that while we're here. And this is where we use the NestG to generate the service in the chat folder. Now we want to put it in a new folder called services, and we'll just call this the conversation for the conversation service. And we don't want the spec file, so we'll just say no spec. We don't want any further nesting, so we'll just say flat. So let's just get that. We'll just check that it generates correctly. So it's updated the chat module, and we can see in our services we've got this service. So we will keep this open because we're going to come back to this. But what we want is we want to start to create our entities to map our tables that we're going to create, and then also have the corresponding interfaces such that we can work with we can use the repository methods using type orm. So let's just start with now we're going to need to work on a few of these simultaneously because of that integrated approach. Like I think we'll just start with the conversation model. So let's just have a conversation entity, and then we'll just see how we get on. So basically what I want to do here is we're going to have a new entity. So, and we're going to call this conversation. And then we're going to export the class conversation entity. And then we can start to use some of the type orm annotations to sort of lay out how our table will look. So on all of our tables, we do have a primary generated column. That's got a unique ID that gets created. So we're going to have that. Now, there's going to be a many relation here between a conversation and a user. So a conversation, it can have many users. So it's only going to have two, but we need to use the many to many to signify that, you know, there's more than one sort of thing. And so every conversation is going to have two users, and every user can have many conversations. So we can just say many to many. We can import that in from type orm, and this is going to relate to the user entity. So we're going to need to open up the user entity as well. So let's open that up. We'll come back to that in just a moment. I'll just finish off this. What we'll do is for many to many relations, you need to specify which way you're sort of joining the table. So, you know, we've got this relation to a user entity. Do we want to get the user in this conversation table, or would we prefer to get the conversation in the user table? So what we can do is we can just have, what we're going to do is we're going to get the conversations. So this is a conversation, for example, and then this is another conversation. When we get the conversation, we want to get the users associated with that conversation. So we want the join to be on the conversation table. So what we can do is we can come here, and on our conversation entity that we're working on, we can just go ahead and just join. the table. And because we're going to have multiple users, we can just specify we're going to have the user entity array here. So that's the first thing. Now with these, you know, nested or integrated tables that have foreign keys to one another, we need to go to the corresponding user entity here. So just down here, down the bottom, I'm going to have a many-to-many. Now this is going to be based on our newly created conversation entity, so we'll just need to import that. And then we take the conversation and we take the conversation entity. I like to suffix it with entity just to distinguish if we're using entity or interface. We can say for that conversation entity, we can get the users. So the users here were defined. So that's a property on this conversation entity. So we can just access it using object notation with the conversation entity dot users. And this is going to relate back to the conversations, which is the conversation entity, and there's going to be an array of them. So we've seen one-to-many relationships and many-to-one. This is the many-to-many. So on both sides, you're going to need to have many-to-many, and you'll need to specify on one of the sides which one you want to join the table on. And then basically this user's property needs to be referenced here, and then we can call this conversation entity, and then there's the join on this table here. So that's the first thing. So let's continue to work on our conversation entity. So we'll get to do an example of a one-to-many now. So basically one conversation can have many messages. So we're going to need to create a message entity now. Just before I do that, I'm just going to do the last property first because it's simpler. The conversation can have an update date column, and we can have last updated. And the reason we have when the conversation is last updated is because the last updated conversation we want to bring to the top of the list. So we can start to work on this one here, but as I said, we'll need to start to create the message entity. So let's just go ahead and copy this shape here, and we can get the message entity dot TypeScript. Copy this. It's pretty much all gonna, we'll just get rid of all that stuff here. Get rid of that, although we'll probably need that as well. I'm just gonna get rid of these for now, but it's gonna re-import them anyway. So I'll just do it like this. Now this message entity needs the name message because that's the name of the table we're going to create. So when the mapping's done between the the type orm and this entity and it generates our table, it's going to be called this. And then we can just rename the class to message entity. Now we're going to have the primary generated column here. But what we're working on is, let's see, the conversation entity. So every conversation can have many messages, and every message can have one conversation. So let me just get this simple column here first. And I'll get the simple properties out of the way. It's obviously going to have the message, so the text you write. And then we're going to have this many to one, which is the converse of this one to many we're about to create. So let's start here. Let's start in the conversation. We'll work on the conversation. But I'll just add this one last property here, which is the simple property, which is the create date column. Now we're going to want the create date column because we want to get the date a message was created at, so we can display that to the user on the front end. So if we return back to our conversation entity, every conversation can have many messages. So now that we have our message entity, we can go ahead and import that. And for the message entity, what we can do is on that, and I'll do a lowercase m here, on that message entity, there's going to be a property called conversation. And then we can have our messages here, which is just the message entity. So if I go to the message entity now, so I can save that. And now it's just complaining about this conversation, but we'll get that going here. So we'll have this many to one here. And it's going to reference the conversation entity. And for the conversation entity, we can take what we just named it. So we've got messages here. So we can get that dot messages, and then we can just go ahead and we can just call this the conversation as we called it in the conversation entity. And this is nothing more but the type of the conversation entity here. So we've got that, and now these errors have gone away. So I think that's what we need on the conversation. So every conversation, you know, there's a unique ID for the conversation. There's a many-to-many relationship because a conversation can have more than one user. It has two users, and the users can have multiple conversations. A one-to-many, one conversation has many messages, and then the update date column, which is last updated. So I think that's the conversation entity. So I may as well do the conversation interface. Conversation.interface.ts. So we can just export an interface here, and we just call this conversation. And we can have an ID, which is a number. We can have the users, which is an array of the user type. And it can have last updated, which is the date. And then we'll just need to import that in. We can save that. So we don't need to specify the one-to-many on the interface. So we'll get that later on with some other joins. So we can just go ahead and close the conversation entity, close the conversation interface, and let's continue working on our message. So a message, it has a unique ID, it has the message itself, it can belong to a conversation. There's many messages belong to a conversation. It's got the create date column, and it's also going to belong to a user, of course. So we'll have a many to one here, where we reference the user entity, and for that user entity, lowercase u here, we say user entity. Now we're going to need to create this again, but basically user, lowercase user entity, messages, and then in this case there's just going to be one user, so we can just let this equal like that. Now this needs to be a comma, and it's saying that messages doesn't exist yet, which is correct. Let's just save that. So we can open the user entity back up, and we can just have a one-to-many here. So I'm just going to copy this one-to-many here, just to get the general shape. Now we want a message entity, and it's going to be the type message entity. We're going to get our messages here. Or okay, this is message entity. So for our message entity, actually we want the user here. So it's got that sort of inverse relation. And then of course we just need to have our messages here, and we just need to import those in. Okay. Let's just check that. So a message, ID, message, user, conversation created, and for the many messages belonging to one user, it references the user entity, references the messages, and then that's referenced here in the user entity. So I don't think we need the user entity again. So let's just go ahead and close the user entity. But what we will need is the message interface. So let's get that. And let's just go ahead and copy this interface here. Message. Now it's going to have a couple more properties. It's just going to have a single user. It's going to have the message, which is nothing more than a string. It's going to have a created at, which is also a date. And then it's going to have a conversation here. So the conversation is a conversation. Well, I accidentally got rid of the user here. So I'll just go ahead and put the conversation here, which is of the type conversation. Okay, so that's the message. So we can close up the message interface. Let's just open up our conversation entity. So, okay, so we don't need that, but what we want to do is, in addition to all the conversations that are created here between two users and their messages, we also want the active message. So when you send a message, let's say the second person in the room is also there, since they're active, we will want to send them a message through the WebSocket communication. So when you just click on one of these rooms, it's just going to essentially just get the messages that already exist. But we want to also have that WebSocket communication where we're able to push, client server client. So we're going to need another entity here, and we're going to call this the active conversation entity. Now you could do some relations here like we've just done and demonstrated in the other files, but these we're going to basically add, remove these constantly, and it's just a little easier if you don't have those foreign keys and stuff like that, but feel free to do it however you want. I'm going to copy this in here. So I'm just going to get rid of a couple things here. Basically, we want this to be called active conversation, and I'm just going to prepend the word active here, active conversation entity. It's going to have an ID, a primary key. Now, rather than do these relations, I'm just going to use the regular column. I'm going to get rid of these here, and this is just going to be a single user. So any one person that creates a WebSocket, so let's say here I'm, where I'm logged in as, well, the server's not running, but I think I'm logged in as John3 here. It would get the user ID of John3, and then we'll have a whole list of active users, and then we'll be able to send them a message through the WebSocket communication. So we're going to need their socket ID. Now, unlike other IDs, this one's generated for us using socket.io, similar to a JSON Web Token. I think it's like a hexadecimal, although it's a little less characters in this one. So there's that. So we're able to, leave a room or leave a conversation based on the socket ID that you've made the connection with. You're able to get the user ID, and we're also going to need here the conversation ID, of course, because the user can have many. They'll have the one socket ID for their active session, but, and I shouldn't overload the word session there, for their WebSocket connection, but we need to distinguish which room they're in based on the conversation ID, so they'll prevent it from sending it to other rooms. And I think that's all we need there for that. So we can just go ahead and close that. We can just go ahead and get the active conversation interface TypeScript file. So let's just copy the shape of the conversation interface. Close that. And close that now. We know the names of the properties. essentially we won't even need that because we're using the ID. So let's just prepend the conversation with the word active conversation. We're going to have an ID. We're going to have a socket ID, which is a string. We're going to have a user ID, which is a number. And we're going to have a conversation ID. So what we can do now is we can just go ahead and do an npm run start dev and just catch any errors if any errors exist, and also just check the tables to make sure things are formatted the way we want them to be formatted. Okay, so we got a unable to connect to the database here. Now we're getting this type orm issue, and one thing I should probably do, I don't know if it's related, it's saying user entity conversation is not found. I haven't actually hooked up the entities in the module. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So if I open this chat module here, we've got our imports. Now I'm just going to, well, I need to write the imports. I'm also just going to get the auth module because I'm using JSON Web Token, the guards and stuff like that. So I'm just going to need to import that in. And then we got this type orm module. And this is where we can hook up our entities that we've just created. So for the feature here, we can have an array of the entities we just created. So I believe it's the conversation entity. And we can see that we've got this conversation service here we generated before. That's cool. Sometimes it doesn't put it in there, sometimes it does. So we got the active conversation entity. And then we got the message entity. So we're just going to need to put a comma here. Got the chat gateway and conversation service. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's see if that helps us out a little bit. So here's our few tables we got. We're expecting a couple more to be generated. Now we're getting this error again, so let's look into it. Okay, so for whatever reason I didn't have this here like that. So let's go ahead and save that. We'll give it another go. Okay, so let's see here. User entity in active conversation entity user ID is not supported by the Postgres database. So what I'm going to do is, I think because I've created these new relations in the user table, I'm going to have to drop the existing tables. So that will mean I will need to create a couple of users again. So if I just go ahead and drop these here, if I try and run this again, we might not get an error this time. So let's just wait this to load up. Okay, so it's still erroring for us, so we must have done something wrong in our code, so we'll investigate this. So you probably spotted this. I didn't realize I typed in the user entity here. So this of course should be a number here. And then you can get rid of that. Save that. Give it another go. And this is why it's good to check incrementally when you make changes. It was a little harder to do that here because, you know, we had this nesting in 3 or 4 different tables here. So we sort of had to do it in one bulk go. But we can see that we've now made our connection here. So let's go ahead and refresh that. Refresh the tables, open it up, and we can see all of our tables here. So let's look at the 4 new ones here. So the first one is going to be the conversations, and it's just going to have an ID and a last updated on, and that's because there's a relation, and then that's in the conversation users user. So the relation with the two users, it has the conversation ID to reference it back to this ID here, but then it has this user ID which relates to the user table that we've seen. Then of course there's the active conversation table here. So it's going to have the socket ID of the the ID of the connection between the user and the client, to signal that they are that person and what conversations they're active in, which references the user ID and conversation ID. Again, I didn't do the primary key approach with the foreign key approach here. You could. It just makes it. It just takes a little bit extra to set up when you're using the doing all the adds and deletes and stuff like that. So that's up to you. And of course you just set up in the same way that we set up the other tables here. But then in the message table, you get the message, who it's by, which conversation it belongs to, and when it was created at. So we've now created all of the tables for us to make our WebSocket connection and be able to send messages from users to users, and we can begin to work on that functionality. We'll start on the back end, and then we'll switch between the back end and front end, and then we'll integrate it all nicely together. So let's build up the logic. Let's start with the back end, and we can close these entities. We can close this chat module. We can close this interface, and the backend files is this chat gateway and this conversation server. So we'll mainly be working with these two. And then on the front end, we'll mainly be working with the chat service and the component consuming that service. So of course we're going to change a few things here. So let's actually just test something. Let's just test that our guard is working. So we'll just run this Ionic serve here, and just above this handle connection, so we've got this on gateway connection which calls handle connection, on gateway disconnect which handles the disconnect. So what we'll do is we'll just say we add these NestJS annotations here, and we'll just pass in the JWT guard here. So let's just go ahead and save that. That should restart the server here. And actually we'll end up wanting this on lots of things. We probably don't, to handle the connection, to disconnect we need the ability to connect, so we just need the guard on the connection there. What's going on here? Oh, I must have typed in. Oh, I need to join again. That's right. Alright. So let's just do this quickly. I'll just join. John@hotmail.com. Password. I'm just going to do one for now because I may need to redo this again. So we get the error message. So basically when we go to here, we'll get our friends, which we don't have any, and we'll have this message here. But the fact that it was able to connect means that it got through the JWT guard that we've set up. and that's all well and good. So it needs to pass that guard to be able to do things. But if it is able to handle the connection, it means everything's alright. So we don't need to have that on other things like handle disconnect and such like that. So let's begin by working on our conversation service. So the very first thing we want to do here is we want to, we checked that it was in the module, it auto loaded that for us. So we want to have a constructor, and in the constructor we want to inject our conversation entity, active conversation entity, and message entity. So we can use the repository method. So we can go inject repository. You can get the conversation entity, import that in. Now this is going to be a private read-only conversation entity, and it's going to be of the type repository for that conversation entity. So that's the pattern there that we use. Now we can just go ahead and bring this down twice. We can get the active conversation entity, and we're going to need to bring that in, and then we're also going to need the message entity, and then we'll bring that in. Of course we'll fix this up. So we'll get that there and that there like that, and then I'll just make this a lowercase here. So we have these, we've injected the repository, so we're able to use our type orm, we can use our functions on those. So for example, if we wanted to save something to the message table, we can use the message entity and so on. We've seen this in previous videos. So I was just getting that, so we have access there. So I'll save this as some formatting here. So let's begin to work on some of the functions, and let's think about some things we will need here. So the first thing we'd probably want to be able to do is creating a conversation. So let's say we had our friends list here. Basically what we'd want to do is we'd want to, when we click on it, we'd want to create a conversation. Now obviously we don't want to create a conversation every time we click on it. Let's say I'm logged in as user 1 and then I'm creating a conversation with user 2. That should also create that same conversation for user 2. So we need to check first by seeing if a conversation exists, so we can get a conversation, see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then we can create one. So we'll probably start off by having a method called getConversation. So let's get that, getConversation, and we're just going to do a bunch of we're going to define the logic that it's basically type orm with the SQL, and then it'll just be easy because we've created the tables, and what we're doing now is we're creating the methods that runs the SQL to interact with the tables, and then it'll be quite straightforward from there. We can just sort of, like from the backend perspective, after that's done, we can just implement those methods, and then we've seen how we can use WebSockets and call that from the front end, and then we'll just need to consume that from the front end. So I mean, this probably is the trickiest video on the playlist, but it's also, we've been building it up, and if you've been following along all the way to now, you've done a great job. And yeah, let's just create it. So we got the get conversation, and we're going to get the conversation based on two things. It's going to be based on the creator ID, because let's look at the conversation here. We're just looking at the shape of things. This conversation, it has an ID, Oh, that's an and a last updated here. So it's got an ID, conversation ID, and user ID. So what's going to happen is it's actually going to create 2 rows. So we can see that like it'll create 1 row here and then 2 rows here, because for every 1 conversation in this conversation table, we're going to have 2 users. So it's going to, let's say there's user 1 and 2 in conversation 1, ID 1 here, and then we'll create 2 rows here. So basically we're going to need to join this user ID with the user table. So let's just open that up so we can get an idea of the shape there. It's going to have this ID here, and then behind the scenes it's going to have a couple of joins that because of the way we've set it up on our entities with our relations. So we can go ahead and just work on that. So like from the front end perspective, we're going to have, you know, the ID of a friend and also of ourselves. So we can get the creator ID quite easily, and also the friend ID. Now what this is going to do is going to return an observable, and it's going to return a conversation or undefined, because it might not exist. And it's okay if it doesn't exist, because we'll just create one. So we can access the conversation repository. And I just realized I called these entities here. These should probably be called repositories. Oops. Repository. So let me just check that. Message entity, message repository based on the entity. Yeah, so I just used the word entity a little bit too much there. You probably caught that. So if you get the conversation repository, what we can do is we're going to have access to the repository methods. So we're just going to use this create query builder, and you know, for the conversation, we'll just call it conversation. That's what we're calling it. It doesn't really matter what you call it, but I'll just call it the same as the table name. You can perform a left join between the conversation. So that's just why I've called it conversation. It just makes it easier to rationalize the joins. So based on that, it's going to have a users. Now, it doesn't have it directly in the table itself, but because we've set the relations in using typeform in the entity, and it has this, you know, this relation, it can determine the nesting for that. So there's going to be multiple users, and they're going to refer to the 2 rows. So for those users here, and we want to, and this table needs to be called user, because we're combining it with this user table here. So you want a left join. So we're combining everything with conversation. We're on the users key. So we can just say where the user ID, this is going to be equal to the creator ID, and we just need to escape any SQL injection. So we can just do it like this here. The creator ID. So it could be the case, you know, the conversation, it could be that the user ID is the creator ID. So when you make the join between the conversation table and the user table, and you're looking at the user ID, you know, a conversation has a creator and, you know, a recipient. So we can just say creator ID and the friend ID. Basically, if it's the case that basically if the creator ID is that, or, and you can have an or where the user ID is equal to the friend, and I might just put a space here, friend ID. So right now this might look a little weird, but basically if you imagine you have a conversation, there's one conversation between user 1 and 2, so it has a conversation ID of 1. Then there's going to be 2 rows here for conversation ID 1, user 1, and conversation ID 1, user 2. You join that with the user table. Based on the ID, that'll just give you access to the properties that we can display on the front end, like the first name and whatnot. But imagine, you know, a user has more than one conversation. So user 1 has a conversation with user 2 in conversation 1, but conversation 2 is a conversation between user 1 and user 3. Now obviously if you're looking through this table based on the friend ID, you could get more than one result, right? So what we need to do is we actually need to group by the conversation ID, because if we group by the conversation ID, we can check if the count is more than 1, and then if it's more than 1, it means the conversation has the creator and the friend both in that one conversation, hence that is the correct conversation to get. So we can just go ahead and implement that logic that we just discussed. We get the conversation ID, group by the conversation.id, and having, and this is where we can do a little bit of SQL, having a count star greater than 1, and then there should only be one match for that, so we can just say here get 1. We can go ahead and we can save that. So just to go through that one more time, a conversation has 2 users in it. We're joining the conversation to the user table, and if the creator ID and the friend ID are both they're both present, then there's more than one person in for that conversation ID, because we can put them in, and since it's more than 1, i.e. it's 2, it's going to return that conversation for us. So that's what we want here. Now we just want to pipe into here, and then we can just use the map operator here. So let's go ahead and get that. And for the conversation, we can, of the type conversation, we either want to return back the conversation or undefined. Now strictly you don't have to do this because it will just be undefined, but this is just sort of helps when you look back at your code just to be like, oh yeah, okay, it's not always there. So with that, we can start to work on the creating of the conversation. So if we have a function here, we call it create conversation. It's going to have a creator, which is a user, and a friend, which is also a user, and it's going to return an observable, and we're going to get back the conversation that we're creating. So we can return, and firstly we can just get the conversation, and we can, since we're passing in, so when you create a conversation, you click on someone, you have that user, and then you also have yourself. So whoever's creating the conversation is the creator. So we can just pass in the creator ID and the friend ID. We can pipe, and we know that this is going to return a conversation here. We want to return a conversation, but we want to return a different conversation. Or we might want to return that conversation, but we could want to create a new conversation. So we'll just go ahead and make use of the switch map pipeable operator. So, you know, that's just going to take the conversation of the type conversation, and then we can just define a variable here, does conversation exist, and this is either going to return a conversation or undefined. So we can say exclamation mark conversation. So the first one just says if it's true or you know, if it's truthy or falsy. So if it's undefined, this will say that it's not undefined, and then not undefined means it's undefined or it's falsy. So then it will be, does conversation exist equal to false. But if this exists and then we say not that, that will be false, but the second exclamation mark will negate the falsy statement, and it will, you know, execute to being true, or equate to being true. So basically we can just do this simple if check here. So if does conversation exist, if it doesn't exist, we'll go ahead and we'll handle that. So we can have a variable here, new conversation of the type conversation, and this is going to be equal to, now all we really need here are the users. So we've got the creator and the friend. The conversation has both of those in there. So what we can do here is we can just return from this conversation repository, and we can save the new conversation. And if we just look at the type here, you know, we've got the two users here that we're saving in there. The ID in the last updated, they'll get automatically put in there for us, sort of thing. So this will return here, but if it makes it past this if statement, it means the conversation does exist. So what we can do is we can just return the observable of the conversation. So that should be enough to create a conversation. So the next thing we want to do, and we're just going to, as I said, we're going to go through this backend, the logic, the service, then implement it in the gateway, and then in the front end. So basically what we want to have a look at, so we're able to create a conversation and we're able to get a conversation. We might want to get all of the conversations for a particular user. So if I'm a user and I got a bunch of friends here, I want to be able to get all those conversations. So I can have this method here, get conversations for user, pass in the user ID, which is a number, returns back an observable of the conversation array. Now I can return from this conversation repository, create query builder for the conversation. Now I'm just going to move this onto another line here. I can do a left join, and I'm actually just going to copy a little bit of this here. I can do a left join, the conversation users with the user, where the user ID is going to be equal to the user ID here. Now I just want to have this ordering on it, because when you get your users, you want to have them in the order in which you've last talked to them first. So you can just get this conversation dot last updated, and we can do the descending order of that, and then there's going to be multiple here, so we can just go ahead and do that. Now right now we might want to get the users in a conversation. So let's say we'll have a function here called get users in conversation. So based on a conversation ID, you could imagine a scenario where you want to get the users based on that. So we can just say we have an observable here of the conversation type, an array. So let me just copy this here. It's going to be quite similar. It's just another helper method that we can use. Create query builder conversation users user, conversation ID. So even though we're doing a join here, we might want to do an inner join and select, because here we joined it but we didn't actually get the users, whereas here we're actually getting the user based on the conversation ID. So they're based on different things, ID or conversation ID. So we create this query builder conversation. So I'm just checking things are okay. I believe they're okay. Doing an inner join between the conversation table and the user table, where the conversation ID is equal to the conversation ID, and we don't need this order by, although you could, but it wouldn't make a difference for us, because we're just passing it by the conversation ID. So we're only expecting 2 users to come back. You've created a conversation. For that conversation, you pass it in. You pass the ID of it in, and then you get the users back in that conversation. So now we have that. We can have get conversations with users, and there's a large number of ways one could do this. You could very much simplify the code a little bit, you know, using type orm. If you're better with type orm and you know all the methods and stuff like that, you know, you could obviously make a nice query. I just find that when you're doing this query builder and you're using multiple of them, things get a little bit complex, so I just sort of separating it out into their own. So, and of course you could even set up the entities better with their own joins and stuff like that, but we'll just do it based like this. So we're going to get all the conversations with the users. So we can just go ahead and return. So we can get the conversations for the user. Based on the user ID. So you're a user, you're logged in, you've got access to your user ID. You want to get the conversations and you want to get the users. So obviously you're going to be a user, but you want to get the other person in the conversation. You pass in the ID, and then you can just go ahead here and you can just pipe and take one, and then we can just go ahead and we can just do a switch map. So we're getting the conversations for a user. We only need to subscribe. Well, before we subscribe, we only need to get that once, because otherwise we'll just call it again. So take one, switch map, conversation. It's going to be a conversation array. Now I'm doing this switch map mainly just to map it to the conversations here. And there's probably better ways to do this than this approach here, but I just wanted to highlight the another important RxJS operation, and that is the merge map. I don't think we've used that much. So basically what this will do is, well, firstly, this return, getting the conversations gets multiple conversations, and then for each of those conversations we want to get the users in the conversation. So then we can, based on the conversation ID that we're getting back from the conversation or conversations, you know, we can get the user or users in that conversation. So getting conversation for users, it gives you back a bunch of conversations, and then the merge map can be used to for each one of those conversations, we can just go ahead and we can just return this dot get users in conversation based off that conversation ID. Now what this will do is, rather than giving back an array of conversations, it's going to give back one conversation, well, each conversation at a time, with the users. So it has this join here. So that's going to come in handy, and we'll see that implemented on the front end shortly. So what we would want next is the ability to join a conversation. So if we want to join a conversation, we're going to need a few things. We're going to need the friend ID. We're going to need the user ID. And we're also going to need the socket ID. And that's going to be a number, string respectively for those three parameters. So what it's going to return back is an active conversation. So we've created that, and just to reiterate, an active conversation is going to occur when you click on a conversation. You click on a user you want to message, and you're going to get, when you're connected, you're going to have your socket ID, so that's going to be part of the active conversation. You're going to have, your user ID, and you're also going to have the conversation that you're in, so the conversation ID will be needed there as well. So we're going to need those three properties. Now, first things first, we need to get the conversation. So we can return this.getConversation as we did it before, and we can just go ahead and just pass in the user ID and the friend ID, and then we'll just pipe into that, and then we'll just use the switch map operator here, and then we'll have the conversation, and basically by this stage you should have a conversation if we set things up. But sometimes, with subscriptions and stuff, they might fire twice, or those sorts of things can happen easily. So it's good just to have a couple of checks, and we'll just check basically if the conversation doesn't exist. I'm just going to have this console log here, or console.warn maybe, and I'm just going to say no conversation exists for user ID, and then we can just get the user ID and friend ID, and of course you could handle this, you could do error handling or whatever, but I don't think it's necessary because this is something we're not really expecting to happen. But if it does happen, for whatever reason, basically what we would want to do is we just want to return an empty observable, so it won't error, but it also just won't join the conversation. So we're not really expecting that to happen anyway, but that's just so it fails gracefully or whatever. So we can have a constant variable here called conversation ID, which is, since we've made it past here, we're obviously going to have the conversation, and every conversation has an ID. So I can just go ahead and return from So I'm just going to get the auth service in here. And we can see that the auth service, we may need to create something here. Okay. So below the login method here, we're going to have get JWT user. You pass in the JWT. And you get back either a user or null. So we can return, and this has the JWT service in it, which, you know, it's a library, and then we can use this verify async and pass in the JSON web token here, and then we can pipe, and then we can map, and then we can destructure the user that we get. So if you're not sure what the type is here, what we get back after we verify our JSON web token is an object of the user type here. And then we can just simply return that user there. Let's see here. Is there an extra arrow here? And this here. Okay. Now, if this doesn't work, we can just go ahead and do a catch error. You could do a try catch as well, but you know, we're already in this RxJS sort of style. So we'll just return null here. So that's why we need the auth service, because we need to, you know, get the user based on the JSON web token. And remember, the JSON web token, that's coming from the request. So they've signed in their JSON web tokens in local storage. It's attached to each subsequent request. When they make the request, you can extract the JSON web token, and then we're able to get the user from the JSON web token. So we can return back to our gateway. So that's why we got auth service there. Now, what we want next is we want the conversation service that we're just working on. So we got that. So basically on module init, we can access this conversation service. We can say remove active conversations. So remember, this is only happening once. And I'm going to put a note here. I know I'll put a note over there as well, but just to make things super clear. Runs when server starts. So this hasn't got to do with people connecting through a WebSocket connection. This is just when the application runs, it will eventually find this class here, this chat gateway, and it will instantiate it. And then I'm just removing any lingering active conversations or anything like that that might occur. So I can just pipe into this, and just so I don't get any memory leaks, I can just take one here and subscribe to that. So I'm just going to go ahead and control period, get that in. Now I'm going to duplicate this down twice, and I'm just going to remove the messages here, and I'm going to remove the conversations in an analogous way. Now the web server, WebSocket server is just the server. We got this JSON web token guard on handle connection. So this is where we can start to I might uppercase these characters. So I'm just going to, when you make the connection, we want to get the JSON web token, and we have our socket. So we can say for the socket, there's this method called, and obviously we need to pass in socket. So socket, where is socket? Socket, that's just coming from socket.io. So, and we're able to pass that in, we can pass that into any of our methods we want. So there's actually this method on it called handshake. And we're able to extract the headers from there, and in particular we can get the authorization header. Now if that isn't true for whatever reason, we'll just say null here just for type safety, although you know it's got the JSON web tokens past the guard, it's going to have it sort of thing. So this .auth service.get JWT user, we just created that. We can pass in the JWT. We can subscribe. We'll get back our user. And we can say if the user doesn't exist, this handle disconnect, and we'll just pass in the socket here. So we can just copy this signature here. Here, like I said, you can put it wherever you want. We'll import user here. So I'll just check that imported from the right spot. Yeah, looks like it. So basically if there's no user, we'll handle disconnect. Now there should really be a user by this stage. We've got like all these checks going on. But you know, just when you're developing, sometimes not everything's set up properly, and these extra checks just save you. So otherwise we want to do everything else. So that means the user exists. So on the socket, on the data for the user, well, we can put a user on that data object based on our user here. So what I might do here, I might just delete this line. I'm going to have a function here called get conversations, and that's going to be based on the socket. So remember, the socket is going to have user data on it now. And I'm also going to pass in the user ID in particular. So I'm going to need to create this get conversation function here. So I'm just going to do this here. Get conversations. Could be a private method down the bottom or something, or refactored. But I'm just going to chuck it here. I mean, obviously, if you made it to this video, you know quite a lot about coding and refactoring and stuff like that. So I just want to focus on the more interesting stuff. So this is actually going to be a subscription. And for some reason I'm not getting I'm just going to import that. I think it's from, oh, it is coming in. It's just, I probably need to return the subscription. So what I'm going to do, I'm I'm going to return this .conversation service .get conversations with users based on the user ID. Now we don't want to pipe and take one here because what we're doing, recall that we're actually doing this merge map thing. So it's going to emit, you know, rather than an array of conversations, it's going to make this extra, query to the database and then get the users associated with the conversation. And it's going to emit those one at a time sort of thing. So we don't want to actually make the mistake of using the pipe take one or anything like that. It's actually deliberate here. And then we can just go ahead and we can just subscribe and we can get the conversations. So we know they're going to be an array of conversations. Actually, we don't know that. We're going to get, okay, so actually that's kind of true, kind of wrong. Basically what's going to happen is because we're getting one conversation at a time, we will be getting all of our conversations, but we're getting it in a stream of single conversations being emitted. So we will, that is true, but basically what we want to do is we want to say to the socket ID. So if I'm connected, it's going to have my socket ID. To that socket ID, I want to emit an event called conversations, and then I'm going to pass in the conversations here. Yeah. And it turns out, I think this is going to pass something like this. So it's going to have a conversation, an array of one conversation. So on the front end, that means. So let's go back a step. Let's say I'm logged in and I have 3 friends. I want to get those 3 conversations, and the way I've got it set up with the merge map, it's going to subscribe to this method here, and then, you know, this might be ID 1. It's going to emit this, but the subscription stays open, and then it's going to emit another thing like this, and then another thing with ID 3. It's not going to be the like this sort of format here. It's going to be one at a time. So we basically, on the front end, we can just take the 0th element because one's getting emitted each time, sort of thing. So we'll see that on the front end. So yeah, that's getting the conversations for us. So if we return back when we connect, you know, based on our JSON web token, we can get our user, and then for that user with our socket ID connection, we can get the conversations, and those conversations are going to come with users because we need to both our and the friends data to display things like images and stuff like that, dates and who created which post and stuff like that. So that's get conversations. Handle disconnect. It's going to take the socket. I'm just going to make this like that. So this is going to take the conversation service, and then we can just leave the conversation, and based on our socket ID. This is going to fire each time we handle the disconnect. So we can just pipe into that and just take one here. And then we can go ahead and we can subscribe here. What's going on? Leave conversation. If I just take a look at leave conversation, it's the socket ID is a string, and all it's doing is it's deleting based on the socket ID that you've passed in. So if I handle the disconnecting, I pass in the socket ID. Take one. Oh, it's just a bracket. Okay. Okay. So now before we're able to send a message, we should be able to, let's just copy this, get the shape of it. We want to have an event called create conversation, and we'll give the method the same name. It takes the socket, and it also takes the friend, which is a user, and then this .conversation service .create conversation socket.data.user. Now remember, we handled the connection, and if it didn't disconnect, we've attached the user object based on the JSON Web Token, so the current user that's logged in to that socket data user there. So that means we can create a conversation with that attached object, and we can also just pass in the friend. So it's going to be the logged in user and the other person in the conversations. You know, you need two people to have a conversation, so you pass in both those people. We've already handled the logic in the service. We can just go ahead and we can just take one, and then we can go ahead and subscribe. And we don't really need to, you know, get the return of the create conversation, because what we can do is we can just go ahead and we can just get the conversations again. So we have that method there already set for us. So this .get conversations, we can get the socket, we can get the socket.data.user.id. So record get conversations here. It gets it based on your socket and your user ID. And then, you know, we'll emit the conversations. So socket message, this server, oh sorry, wrong message. Socket data user ID. And just save that. So that handles the creating a conversation. Now the reason we're also emitting conversations again is because when you first load it up, it doesn't necessarily mean all of your conversations have been created. Recall that we create a conversation not when we add a friend or click accepted, but when we actually click on the friend and we open up the conversation. So that's when a conversation is created. Now if it is created, then we've seen how it handles that. It just returns the conversation that already exists. But if you create a new conversation, you're going to need to re-get all of the conversations. So when we're subscribed to that on the front end, you know, we're getting the latest data. So now we're able to work on joining a conversation and leaving a conversation, and then we'll come back to sending a message to complete off the chat gateway. So I know it's been a long video, but there's a lot to cover, and it's quite integrated. There's lots of things that you need to do in a bulk. Sort of like all those entities are related, and all of those service methods. You need all of the logic written out, and then we can handle the gateway. And it's sort of WebSockets are quite interconnected between the front end and back end. So this is probably by far the hardest video, but it's also probably the last video, unless there's any major bug changes or any major fixes that need to be done. So yeah, we're almost there. Probably only need another 30-45 minutes or something like that. But yeah, let's just continue off. We'll let's just copy this shape here. So we've got the create conversation, we've got the send message. We're going to have a join conversation, and join conversation is going to be here. And rather than message here, we're just going to get the friend ID, the number. Now we're going to access this .conversation service, join conversation. Now we've set up the logic, so we just need to pass in our arguments here for friend ID, socket data, user ID, and socket.id. So let's just have a look here. Friend ID, user ID, socket ID, friend ID, socket ID. User ID, socket ID, because we touched the user to the socket. So we know this is going to return an active conversation. So let's just go ahead and just pipe into that response. And we'll tap into that actually. So we can get the active conversation of the type active conversation. Conversation. Now I'm just going to import this tap from RxJS. So when you join a room, you get the active conversation back. So this basically what we want to do is get the messages. So we can just say this .conversation service. When we're in an active room, we can get the messages, and we're getting the messages based on the active conversation ID. We can go ahead and we can pipe into that, and we can just go ahead and just take one here. And I think I will just need to import active conversation, the model there, the interface. So I'm able to subscribe here, and I can get the messages, which is an array of messages. And for those messages, I'm able to say, okay, this .server.to to the socket ID, emit an event called messages, which is just going to be the messages. And messages will need to be imported here. And all of this, we're piping, let's see here. So we'll need to pipe to the outer observable, and we can just say, okay, we'll just take one for that, and we can just go ahead and subscribe. So just to recap that method, when we join a conversation, we've got our socket and we have our user ID, and then we also need to get the friend ID, so we're going to get So based on those, you can get the active conversation. So when you click on a conversation, that'll be the active conversation. And then for that active conversation, you want to get the messages. So based on the conversation ID, you can get all the messages there. And at this stage, we're considering, like, based on whoever the logged in user socket is, they'll get those messages. So if someone else is logged in, they'll have their own socket ID, and then they'll get all those messages emitted to them. Now you could do this with like an API approach, but since we're doing everything the WebSocket approach, we may as well have it in a cohesive manner such as this. So that's the join conversation. Now I'm just going to have a leave conversation, and then we can return to our messages, and then that will be it for the backend basically. So leave conversation. So we don't need that. So we've already got our socket. By this stage, it's well established that we've got our socket. So we can just say the conversation service, pass in the socket ID. Oh, sorry, we're going to have to leave as well. Leave conversation, pass in the socket ID, and then we can just come in here. We can pipe, take one, subscribe. And that's all we really need to leave the conversation. So we have the ability to join a conversation, have the ability to leave a conversation, we have the ability to create a conversation, and we're able to get our conversations and handle that connection and handle the disconnect. And we're also clearing up all of our conversations on the module init here. So all that's left is the send message. This is the most interesting part, because this is what, so everything we've set up has been basically the infrastructure to be able to send the message. So it's be nice when it all comes together and we're able to send the message. So basically, to send a message, we're going to need the socket, and I might just call this new message just to distinguish between the getting the existing messages and the new messages. I'm just going to go and get rid of this, but the socket, that will just come because we've got the socket. New message. Now this is actually going to be a message. So recall message has an ID, like the text, message, user, conversation, and created that. So basically, now this probably won't happen because this will be handled on the front end, I suppose, but it's probably good just to have this, if there is no new message, conversation, just return an observable of null. That'll just make it so things handle gracefully, but that shouldn't actually even happen. So we can actually just do some object destructuring. So basically, recall that on the socket data we put a user object, so we can just go ahead and destructure that. And we can say for the new message that passed in. So when we get it, I think it's just going to be the string and the conversation. But there's also a user, and the user is just going to come from the user from the socket. So we can just go ahead and use object notation and attach the user here. And now we can have our if statement here. So if the new message has a conversation and has an ID, and this should just happen because we've got this check here along with the front end check, but just, you know, just to be extra safe here, if the conversation service, we create a message, we have a new message here, we can just go ahead and we can just pipe into that new message that we're trying to create, and we can just take one here, we can subscribe, and for that message that we're getting back, so this is going to have some of the good data for us, like the ID and stuff like that. We can say new message dot ID is equal to message ID, because when you pass it in from the front end, all you know is who sent it and have the text. By that stage, it hasn't actually created the ID, but when you save it using the the SQL query or the typeform that performs the SQL query, then we can get that message ID back. So then we can attach that to the new message that we're going to emit. So here we can say for the conversation service, we can get the active users, and this is going to be for the new message dot conversation. So we got the conversation, we got the ID of the conversation based on that, and then we can say we can pipe into here, take one, we can subscribe, we can take the active conversations, which is an array of active conversations, and then for those active conversations, what we can do is we can say, okay, active conversations here. So for each of those active conversations, so at most it's only going to be 2. Basically, so what we're doing here, we're sending a message and we're getting all the active users that are in that particular conversation, and if they're not active when they go on it, they'll just they'll get the messages when they join the conversation by emitting all the messages. But if they are in the room and there's multiple people in the room, we need to go through each of those, and for each of those active conversation, so each active conversation, basically what we want to do is this is where we want to emit to the from the server to the active conversation dot socket ID, and here we just want to emit a new message. So new message here. Okay, so that's cool. So just to recap, when you send the message, first you check, the message has the conversation, the ID of the conversation, and based on the conversation ID in which the message is coming from, we're able to create a new message, and we're able to get the ID of that message. And after we have the ID of the message, we're able to get all of the active users in that particular room, in that conversation. And for all of those active people, so up to 2, obviously there's going to be 1, because there's going to be one person sending a message, but someone else could be in that room. They're able to retrieve that information from the back end, and we'll subscribe to it on the front end, and then we can get that new message there. So that's pretty much all there is in terms of the logic in the back end. Now we just need to subscribe to it in a similar way how we have in other videos and use it all. Now there is a little bit of setting up to do there, but it's relatively straightforward from this point on. So if you've been following along for this long video, you're doing really well, and now we can just reap the rewards. So I'm going to need to just add 2 more users, and also just add some images and stuff. So I'm just going to Let's see here. I got an unauthorized. It means my token's expired. So while I'm signed out, I'm going to have a and I set the token to like 30 minutes for development purposes, so that's something you would change in production, but you know how to do that. So let's say I have here John2 P john2@hotmail.com, password, accept and join. Come back here, John3, John3 P, accept and join. I'm going to sign in as John3 here. I'm going to write a post, John3. Let's see here. This is John3. Doesn't really matter. I just want to upload an image here. Let's get this Ionic logo here. Let's just sign out. John2@hotmail.com, password. Alright, I'm going to have this Mongo symbol here. So I might just add John3 here. I can also go to John1 and add him here. Sign out. Now sign in as John1. Now I'm not going to have an image here because I need to handle the case that I don't have an image, so I'll just use this blank image here. As you can see, I've got a message from John2. I can go ahead and accept that. And I'll connect with John3 here. And I need to log back in as John3. Probably could have done this more elegantly, but let's just log in as John3. John3 here has 2 requests from John2, John1. So I accept both of those. I can't remember if I sent a request to John1. Okay, I think I did. What about John3? Okay. So I'll just sign out here, and now I'm going to log in as John1 here. Close that. Close that. And navigate to my messaging tab. So now you can see that I got these 2 friends here, and I can click between them. Now, right now we got name, last name here. Now this role, we didn't include this in the data model, so this would just be hard coded, but you easily could. And we can see that we don't have a picture here. So let's go ahead and start to work on the front end side of things. So a good place to start when doing full stack apps is starting with the database tables, then doing the service, and then the gateway or controller, and then going to the front end and working on the service to be able to, you know, interact with the back end, and then make the visual changes. So we've got this function here, get friends. That's an API request, and we've already set that up. So that's getting these friends here. Now we want to this should stay the same. Get new message. It's going to get the message, although this is going to be a message. This is going to be a message. So we're going to need to define a couple of types here. So let's go ahead and define these types. Now in these models here, we've got friend request and post. Let's create a file. Let's call it message. Now you might want the .interface.ts, but it doesn't really matter. So what we can do here is we can just export an interface and we'll call it message. And you might want to namespace things and stuff, but I'm not going to do that here. So we'll have an ID, we'll have the message, the text, which is just a string. We'll have the user, which is of the type user. We're going to have the conversation, which is of the type, well, we need to create this. And created at, this is going to be a date. So let's create another model here. Conversation.ts. So here we're going to export the interface conversation. It's going to have an ID of number. It's going to have users, so the two users. And it's also going to have a last updated, which is a date. So we'll just go ahead and we'll get this user model in here. And now we should be able to get this conversation here, okay. So we can save that. And then we can start to look back at our chat service here. So now we have this type, get new message. We can get that in here. So we've got get friends, get new message, send message. Let's just work on send message. So it's got the message string, but now we want to get the conversation as well. Because we need to send the message to a particular conversation. And what we can do here is we can say new message is going to be of the message type, so we'll construct this. And then we'll pass in the message and the conversation. The user gets attached as we've seen just before. And then we can just go ahead and send this new message here. So that's getting the friends, getting and sending messages. What we might want to do is have the ability to create a conversation. So for this, we are getting the, recall we're getting, I'm going to close these down. Let's see here, where is it? Create conversation is, well, the socket's already there, so we just need to pass in the friend. So because we're the user, we just need the friend to create the conversation with. So here we can just pass in the friend. This is nothing more than the user. So just create conversation, get the friend, and we can just say this .socket .emit create conversation, same as it is here, because that's what we're subscribing to. We're emitting the event and then we're getting the result of that. We're not getting the result, but that result's being processed for us. So when we emit things, it's emitting to the backend. When we're getting something from event, you know, it's going to be, this is emitting to the backend, an event to the backend. This is coming from the backend. So create conversation. You can just go ahead and just pass the friend straight in like that. It's nice and simple. So let's go ahead and just copy this down. So we might have one called join conversation. And here we just need the friend ID. This is just a number. And rather than create conversation, we'll have join conversation. And rather than friend, we'll have friend ID. Now, analogously, we'll have leave conversation. Now, actually, we don't even need anything for that because the socket's already existing on the back end. So we just need to leave the conversation, and that's all we need to do. Now, all we really need to do, we have the ability to join, leave, create conversations, and get and send messages. So the missing link for us is just, and I might put this get friends because it's an API call. I might just put that one up the top. And then, so we've got leave conversation, and then the last thing we need here is get the conversation messages. So this is going to be an observable, and we're going to get an array of messages. We can just return this .socket from event, and you know the type's going to be the same. Again, you only need it once, probably here, and then TypeScript will have type inference for this, but I sort of just like this personal preference, but it's up to you. And these is the messages. So that's the chat service, and we've worked on, now we just need to work on our component a little bit. So we should have everything that we need. So let's return to our component here, and it looks like we got an error on submit. So first things first, we're getting the message from the form. Then we're sending the message, but this now takes a second argument, which is going to be this .conversation. Now this doesn't exist yet, so we're going to need to come back up to the top here and just define a couple of properties. So we've got the user full image path, which is a string. We're going to need the user ID, and we have that on the auth server, so we'll be able to get that, no worries. We then probably want to have conversations, which will be an array of conversations, and we'll initialize that to an empty array. And I'm just going to disconnect because I need to do a little bit of coding before we can check a few things. But yeah, the conversations, it's just going to be an array of conversations. We'll bring that in. Now we just need a singular conversation, which can just be blank. And then I might have one more of these. So the conversations, the observable version, which is the observable version of that. And I won't initialize this. So we got new messages, the observable. We got messages, which now is a array of the message type. So we've got that. Now we got friends, which is an array of users. We got a friend, which is user. We got a friend with behavior subject version. We got a selected conversation index number initialized to 0. We got a user image path subscription. I'm going to have a user ID subscription. We got the messages subscription. I'm going to have a conversation subscription. And I'm also going to have a new messages subscription. We've got the friend subscription, and I'm also going to have a friend singular subscription. So I'm just going to copy these down to our Ion view did leave. Now, I think we got 4 more of these. So I'm just going to unsubscribe to that, unsubscribe to that, unsubscribe to that, unsubscribe to that. And let me just check things here. This user image path, messages subscription, user ID subscription, friends subscription. Let me move that one down to friends so it's grouped nicely. Conversation. New message here. Friends. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. So that's the variable set. And we will need to come back to the template and display things correctly, but let's just work on the logic a little bit on the TypeScript side of things. We've got the chat service, we've got the auth service. Ion view did enter. We say this user image path subscription, we get the subscription and then we unsubscribe to it. This message subscription. Well, let's get the user ID subscription. That one's going to be easier to do. So we can say this dot user ID subscription is equal to this auth service dot user ID dot subscribe. We can get the user ID, which is just a number, and then we can say this dot user ID is equal to ID or user ID. So we set that user ID here. We set it to user ID, and we'll use that to pass into some of the methods we've created. So let's work on the this.conversation subscription. Now this is going to be on the chat service. We can get the conversations. So maybe I missed that one on the chat service here. Get conversation. So let's just get that. We can just copy this down. And we can say get conversations. It's going to return an array of conversations from the event conversations. I'm just hoping I've spelled everything right here, because I've done a bit of a bulk go here. But if I return back to the chat component, there should be the get conversations here. So I can go ahead and I can subscribe to those. And for the conversations that I get back of the type conversation array, for those, I can just say this dot conversation, this conversations dot push. Now this is where I have the conversation 0. Now recall, I'm going to put a note here from merge map stream. So recall in our chat gateway, if we look at our getting the conversation with the users here, we're getting all of the conversations first, but they don't have the user. So for each conversation, we're going to get another conversation in a stream. And so as I mentioned before, it's going to be in this sort of format, so we need to get the 0th element of the array. And if that doesn't make sense, go back earlier in this video, sort of explain that. But again, the whole approach, of this could be simplified just by having some joins at the entity level and simplifying the query. But it's just another tool in your tool belt, another approach. So basically, we're subscribing to these, and each new conversation that comes in, we're going to push that in. So we'll push that into the conversations. Then we have the messages subscription. So I will actually want to do this differently. So this dot chat service dot get conversation messages. So you want to get all of the existing messages if they exist. You can subscribe here, and for those messages of the type message array, what we can do is we can say all message IDs, because right now we have a message array, but we only need the IDs of the messages to retrieve them. So what we can say, we're retrieving the messages, but we only need the IDs to be able to display them. So what we can say is all message IDs, this is equal to this dot messages Actually, let me just back up a sec there. We got all of the messages for the conversation. So what we can do is we can say for each of those messages, for each message, then we can say const all message IDs. This is going to be exist to sorry, let me start again. Initially there's going to be no messages, but as you add messages, we're going to append to these. And we'll come back to exactly how those messages get populated. So obviously in the first iteration, that won't be the case. That won't exist. But you're subscribing to this, so later on there will be messages, and when you receive a new message, we'll be able to push to that. So I think this will make a little bit more sense with a little bit of code. So if I just go ahead and map something here, I map a message to the message ID. So I'm taking an array of objects, an array of messages, and I'm returning an array of the message IDs. And essentially what I want to say here is firstly, if all of the message IDs, or if that array of message IDs is contained by the message ID, or another way to say that is, if the particular message that we're looping through from the messages we got back, so we're getting a list of messages back that already exist, and for each one of those messages that does exist, it has an ID, and if that ID, if that is already in the, basically if it's not in our current array, because we need a way to display this on the front end, so we're storing in this variable this messages, and if the messages on our front end contain that, or doesn't contain that, basically what we can say is we can say this dot messages dot push dot message. And you might think that's a little bit of overkill. You only really need this messages push message, but what's going on here? Let me just look into that and then finish that point off. So get conversation messages. There's an array of messages. Okay, that looks okay. So this chat service dot get conversation messages, subscribe. Am I missing some brackets or something? Probably. Oh, if statement. Probably need some brackets around it. Let's see here. I'm firstly just going to call this messages subscription. So that's not exactly the issue, but just found that because it's not one message, it's messages. I can save that. Now I'm just going to click on this message here, the message. What's going on? Oh, I got caps lock on. do I? Oh, it must have imported the wrong message somehow. Ah, well, that's interesting. I was wondering what was going on. Okay, so I got the wrong message somehow. This is coming from here. Now, that should be okay. So yeah. The reason I got this checked here rather than just this is because sometimes with these subscriptions, sometimes they fire twice and stuff like that. So I'm just double checking that it's not going to add it to the array twice and get like 2 messages or something like that in the UI. So here we got this dot new messages subscription, and this is going to be equal to the chat service. Get new message, and I can subscribe here. I can take the message that we get back from the subscription. Now, recall that a message at this stage, when we're getting the new message, is coming from the front end, so we're just going to have the message and the conversation. We want to display the created at timestamp, and we can just set that to new date. It does need to save on the server, and it is possible if it's a bit of latency to be a couple of seconds out, but it's good enough sort of thing. It's probably fine. Now you could copy this into a function, but I'm just going to duplicate this code here. So basically, again, when you retrieve the messages and have new messages, you can go through all the existing messages. So this is where this comes in handy. Basically, is by this stage you've pushed all of them. You push the messages here. But when you get to this case, you've got a bunch of messages that already exist, and this is just an extra safety check. So basically, you're not getting duplicated messages when you create a new message as well. So I think that's pretty straightforward. All message IDs, message map, message ID. It's the same code. So that's all there really is to that. And we just added this created at because that didn't exist on the front end. So now we've got this friend subscription. Now I might just completely actually I might do this friend subscription. So this is going to be equal to this dot friend dot subscribe, and this is going to be a friend. This is just going to be of the type any because it's not going to be the type user, because it's not going to contain some of the properties that we need. So basically what we want to do is we're setting below, when we open a conversation, we're setting the friend. So that means here we can subscribe to that, but initially we have this empty object. Now in JavaScript you can't just say does empty object equal empty object. You need to do something a little more sophisticated but not too tricky, because essentially what we want to do is we want to determine if the friend has been updated, but it's not the initial state of the empty object. So basically what we can do here is we can just say json.stringify friend, and initially it's going to be equal to an empty object, but because we're stringifying it, we can say if it's not equal to the string version of the empty array, or empty object. So it's not the cleanest solution, but it definitely works. It's definitely one of the simplest ones. So this .chat service. So if we make it to this stage, we're able to join a conversation based on this .friend ID. So that's cool. We can close that. Now in this friend subscription, we can say this chat service, get friends, subscribe to the friends. We set this friends equal to friends. Now this is where we just want to have an if check. So if the friends dot length is greater than 0, this dot friend equals this dot friends. So you get the friends, and the friends you get back, the very first one that you get, which is this one here, we can set the friend here to that first one that we get back, and we can also say this dot friend, the observable version, we can actively call the next method on that and pass in that friend. And since it's not going to be the initial state of the empty object, we can go ahead and we can join the conversation. And join the conversation means for our user, we created a active conversation in the record. So then when we create new messages, everyone in those active conversations will be able to have that WebSocket communication. So basically what's going to happen now is we know that the friends length is greater than 0. So we can say for each of those friends, what we can do is we can say, well, a friend is just a user, and for each friend or each user, we can call this .chat service .create conversation, because when we get the friends, we need to create the conversation for each one of those friends. So that's going to happen based on the friend. And then after that's done, we can say this .chat service .join conversation. This .friend .id. You can save that. Now another thing we might want to do here is for this chat service, when we leave, we want to say leave conversation. So we can do that. Now for open conversation, we get the friend and the index, change the selected count. Now first we want to leave. So this .chat service .leave. So we leave an existing conversation. And then we set this friend to friend, this friend next, we actively call, we're subscribed to that. And we just want to set the messages back to empty. So they'll change the UI messages back to empty, but then as we're joining the next conversation, we're retrieving, so this will fire basically, and then it will retrieve the next messages that we need. So that's how that's handled. So that's the open conversation sorted. Now we just need to finish the onSubmit method, and then we can go to the UI. And so we get the message. We can say let conversation user IDs equal to this dot user ID, this dot friend dot ID. Let's sort those so we can compare them directly. So then we can say this dot conversations for each. Now for each conversation of the type conversation, what we can do, and this is just conversation, we can let the user IDs, so we're cycling through each of the conversations that we've retrieved and we've set, and we're saying we need the users for that conversation. So we can do a similar sort of thing as before, where we map through the conversation.users and we map through those, and for each user what we do is we turn the array of the user IDs. We can save that there, and we can just go ahead and we can just sort those, and now that they're both sorted we can compare them, because it could be that you get them in a different order. So here what we can do is we can compare the objects again. So we can say JSON.stringify conversation user IDs, is this equal to the JSON.stringify of the user IDs that we just created? And if that's true, we can say this conversation is equal to this conversation that we're on. And then we can say this chat service send message for this conversation. And then we can just go ahead and we can reset the form. All we need to do now is go to our template and work through it. So, you know, we've got our main container, and then we've got our left hand side, our right hand side. We've got our list here, and then we've got our messaging sort of stuff here. This is just to get the visual representation of the HTML we're looking at. So select connection. This was all sort of going to stay the same. We still need the name to change here, and we also need the image. Oh, that's a point. We're going to need to determine the image. So one more method that we'll need in our chat component is deriving the full image path. Derive full image path, and this should be the very last bit of logic that we need. So I'm just going to let the URL equal to HTTP localhost 3000 API feed image. Hopefully that's spelled okay. And if the user ID if that is equal to this dot user ID, what we can say is we can say return this dot user full image path. Else, if the user dot image path, if that exists, then just return the URL plus the user dot image path. Else, if this dot friend dot image path, return the URL plus this dot friend dot image path. Otherwise, just return the URL, and it means there's no profile, so we can just say blank profile picture dot png. Okay. So user one, they don't have a profile image, so it's going to handle that case. That's the logic there. Now, let's return to our template. Let friend of friends, let I equals index, open conversation. You pass in the friend, you pass in the index. You got this ng class. So that's all well and good. Then you've got this iron grid here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have two different iron images here. So two different cases. So in the first case, if the friend image path actually no, that's fine, that's fine. So if there is an image path for the friend, otherwise use the blank profile picture. That's actually okay, because that's on the left hand side. Let's see here, on grid. Yes, that's the left hand side. So we want to work on the right hand side in this chat section here. Basically, what we can say here is we can have the friend dot first name. If that's not there, we can have some text just saying loading. And we can have the friend dot last name, and if it doesn't exist, we'll just be blank, and then this will just be loading. So obviously if you click on something, it should be there. Iron button, chat messages. So let's see here, this iron avatar, I'm going to get rid of this if check here, and I'm going to pass in derive full image path, and this takes the user. So on the message we have the user. Iron coal. So here in this p tag here, I'm going to have a span. And I'm going to say style equals to font weight of 500. Let's say the message.user.firstname message.user.lastname. I know we're doing this in two different ways with the first name, last name from the left and right side, but you will need the message anyway. And on the left hand side you need it to retrieve the friend. So basically after this span here we can just have a little dash here, and we can just say message.created at, and then we can just use a date type here, and we can specify the short type, and then in another paragraph here we can have our message. Okay. And this message is actually message.message. So I think that's just about it. I'm just going to go ahead and start the server here, and then I'm going to check things work on the front end. And I wouldn't be surprised if a couple of things were to break, but hopefully we can get lucky and just run an Ionic serve here. So I'll wait for that to load. So let's go ahead and sign in here. Okay. Let's navigate to the messages here. Now we've got John 2P here, so that's looking good. Look at the server, hasn't broke. No conversations exist. Okay. So let's try it out. Hi John 2. This is John 1. Awesome, that works. Hi John 2, this is John 1. It's got the date here. Appears to be working nicely. So let's go ahead and open a new tab in incognito mode, and we'll see if we can have our conversation work nicely. So I'll go to localhost 8100. Now I'm going to sign in as John 2. You can see the image is working nicely here. I can navigate to messaging. Hi John 2, this is John 1. Click on John 3. Click back on here. Hi John 1, this is John 2. And then we see with the logo that got sent. Yay. Now just to make sure anything weird's not happening, we can go into room 3 here. We can say hey. I can click on room 3 here. Say hey, it doesn't appear in here, but if I go back to this room here, we see the conversation ends up working. And just to triple check, I'll check the database is working okay. So we can see our messages here, and everything appears to be in order. So thanks so much for watching this YouTube series, guys. If you made it this far, big congratulations. That's probably going to wrap up the LinkedIn clone. We've learned a lot: role-based access control, image upload, CRUD upload, infinite scroll, and chat communication for different conversations. So yeah, hopefully this has been exciting for you. Let me know what you want to see next. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. I'll see you in the next video.